In this podcast, Nirit Cohen from Work Futures talks about the future of work. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to Work2.0 podcast. Today we have with us a very special guest, and we have with us Nirit Cohen. And a brief bio: she is the president at Work Futures, HR strategist, thought leader, blogger, speaker on the topic of future of work. Over 25 years at Intel Corp in Israel, EMEA, and global responsibilities in human resource, merger acquisitions, HR, infotech, infosystems, and finance. um, Beautiful and vibrant background, Nidhi. So welcome to the podcast, and thank you for agreeing to speak with our community.
And thank you for having me.
Beautiful. So I think one thing that I found fascinating, rarely we get guests who have spent a good amount of their life in working at a transnational company that's in itself like a big giant ship, right? And you have done with that Intel. So why don't you walk us through your journey, like how you got started into HR and what brought you to Intel and until yesterday or today?
Wow, that's a journey through memory lane. So I joined Intel right after graduating with my master's in finance and business. And I started as a finance analyst. The organization was very small. We're talking 1991. And that's, if you think about it, this is like before Windows. Computers were like green on black, right? No mouse. It was a different world when we communicated via fax machines, and you had to go to this one room in the building that had a fax machine. So yeah, different world. So after a few years, my finance manager moved to become the HR manager for Israel, and called me over to HR to actually run an economic project, if you will. So it was probably a temporary, and you know how temporary evolves, right? So that's how I ended up in HR. And I spent almost 25 years in human resources, from compensation and benefits, through mergers and acquisitions. I spent 3 years, wonderful 3 years, at the corporate headquarters in Palo Alto, California, in Santa Clara in California. Lived in Palo Alto. It was a great opportunity to do global roles. And then I spent quite a few years, almost a decade, as the vice president of Intel HR for Israel. And then few years as starting up an HR strategy office for a Greater Europe region, and then mergers and acquisitions globally. So I spent over a decade actually working a lot of the large mergers and acquisitions for Intel globally. So very long, fascinating career. I was very fortunate. Intel is a wonderful company, and I was really able to do multiple careers in there for almost 30 years.
Wow, that's fascinating. And how do you spend your time nowadays?
So I retired from Intel last year. But the interesting story is about 10 years ago, we started looking into the future and asking ourselves, how do we need to prepare the organization for 2020, which is tomorrow, but back in 2009 was a decade away. And so I worked with our strategy organization to actually take methodologies we use to forecast and futurecast and then backcast for the purposes of business, to actually look at the organization and ask, what would it feel like to be an employee in 2020, and then what do you need to do in 2018 and 2016 and then in 2010 to get there. And so I started that project on the side, if you will, in 2009. And generated quite a few use cases for where the world will be in 2020, which is interesting to see when you look at them today, right? Some happened 5 years ago, some didn't happen yet, some probably never will. And as I was doing that, I got hooked. So the
Mm,
idea of really understanding on how to kind of where the world was evolving, understanding there are really big tectonic changes. This wasn't just, a nicer iPhone, if you will, and that we had to do something very different. And so I started blogging about it. Started a blog about 7 years ago. My son was my first like on the blog. I have 80,000 readers today. I have a regular paper column in the Israel Globes. It's like the Financial Times of Israel. I'm almost finishing my book, and I'm really passionate about this topic. And so when I left Intel, this is what I do. I started my own company, Work Futures, and I work at all the levels, right? So the future of work affects us as people and our careers. It affects organizations and management, and then it obviously affects the larger systems, the education and as well as the different social systems we have in place. So I have a lot of fun working with a lot of levels of a lot of implications of this. And this is what I do today.
interesting. And I think we had prior conversations about this topic of future of work, and I think what I find really fascinating about your background and about your sort of your abilities to help others understand where this industry is heading to. Like from and right now you were part of an Intel, and now you're being outside helping businesses out. How has your perspective changed when it comes to the enterprise understanding of future of work, or or their preparedness towards it, or how they're equipped to handle the challenges of this new reality of work? Like what is your observation?
I think part of what we understand is that the players are changing, right? So the way enterprises think about this is you think about jobs and you think about org hierarchies and you think about projects, and we still consider success as retention of people,
Hmm.
right? So we own the capital, we own the people, we own the project. When you look outside in the broader world, you see a lot of what we, by the way, called in the popular press jobless recovery, right? So you see a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
economic activity that is happening outside the standard of an employer and employee relationship, right? So you see networks evolving, so work being done through people coming together to do the work. And there's a lot to be learned internally for how work gets managed, from how
Hmm.
work gets managed externally and in the ecosystem that isn't corporations, right? Because we still try to reorg every time there's
Hmm.
a big change, which is really having the org structure chase the reality, as opposed to ask, how do we enable people to come together in different formats and think about what is the role of management and what is the role of hierarchy, and how do you separate between managing work and managing people.
Hmm.
So there's a lot to be learned from how work gets done when it's not encumbered by the history of corporations.
Interesting. And I think one thing that we found fascinating with our conversation with HR leaders, um, and they're primarily from two broad containers. So one is very legacy companies representing them, having them slew through this evolution of technology and new economic realities. The others are from this new age of enterprise organizational structure, very cool, hip, and just very agile and lot more rapid in responding to any situation. So now you have been from an Intel world and very ginormous organization, very uh, what we say, uh, organizationally mature, have a culture in place. They have seen thicks and thins throughout many disruptive times. So now, if you look at the outside world and now look back in your previous days, and many companies are like Intel. Like what is your take on what bigger companies or companies with stronger cultural background and legacy should do to prepare themselves with this new sort of emerging reality of work?
I think it starts with understanding who is the talent at your disposal to actually go do the work, right?
Mm.
So if we look at the trends from owning, a drill to drill a hole in the wall, and instead say, I need a hole in the wall, how can I get it, right? Um, this concept of what is the access to talent. So huge corporations have a lot of talent internally that even within the company it doesn't necessarily shift at the right time to the right place. We're bound by who reports to who, how do you release people, the knowledge, the ability of the right talent to move to the right project at the right time is a big boundary within organizations today. I think there's a lot of potential to be had from creating flexibility systems, which is kind of maybe an odd combination of words, but enabling people to shift themselves. So, what we try to do historically in organizations is manage things from the top. But if it's a network, it can't be managed, it needs to be enabled. And so, figuring out how to enable people to shift themselves to where the passion is, to where the work is that they're good at, that they can contribute, and it's very scary, right? Because you
Mm.
lose a level of control. But on the other hand, there's a lot of untapped talent in organizations today that isn't doing what it could be doing and that isn't maximizing potential. We see the engagement numbers are very low
Mm.
because people aren't necessarily doing what they're most passionate about. So I think that's one of the bigger aspects of really shifting the ability we manage the work and we enable the networks to form within organizations. I think the other one that's very, very big in implications is everyone talks about bringing in technology and automation, right? But really and truly understanding how that changes the work, that changes
Mm.
roles, it changes who does what and who should be doing what, right? So we almost as an afterthought sometimes circle back to the people in the organizational structure, and then we wonder why the automation didn't create an impact. I like to think about whiteboarding. So what would it look
Mm.
like if we started from scratch? How would you build it, and then um, how do you get there from where you are today, as opposed to just taking small leaps. Well, when we did the Intel 2020 project back in 2010, right? It was clear that we didn't ask what should we be doing in
Mm.
2012. We asked what should we be doing in 2020, and once we figured that out, we asked how do we get there, right? Um, so I think that's the other part. Everybody knows culture is very strong, right?
Mm.
But culture is being very strong is also working against the changes today.
Mm.
And so if I bring this back to the previous comment, if you think about accessing talent in a different way, if you actually bring in talent from the outside that isn't necessarily your regular full-time, that you
Mm.
don't necessarily integrate them the way you would a regular full-time, you start getting different voices. You start getting people that ask, or suggest other ways to do things. And you'd have to bring in a bit of chaos and feel uncomfortable. But there's no other way. You can't manage your way through this.
Interesting. I think I found fascinating to like how could you plan 10 years like ahead, like how can you plan what's the world is going to be in 2020 when you're 2009? How do you s- sketch that? If you can walk us through that that psyche or that psychological work that one needs to do just to figure out, okay, this is what I'm planning for. Like how do you do that?
So probably planning is the wrong word.
Hmm.
Um, and by the way, notice that when we put that challenge out there, we said, what would it feel like to work in 2020? Because it starts moving us in a different direction. We looked at
Hmm.
a lot of trends. Many of them you'd think have nothing to do with it, right? I mean, I remember us looking at trends in the urban space, trends
Hmm.
in communications, trends in areas that you wouldn't necessarily think are connected. We took a large group of people, about 300 people, and we walked them through a process. We basically brought a lot of trends, a lot of speakers, and then we asked them um, to create a world that they think would be there out in 2020, and people did. So, for example, someone actually sketched out a concept that basically was everywhere will be the new location. And
Hmm.
back in 2010, this is like before WeWork, right?
Hmm.
It was unheard of. The idea that Intel and Microsoft and Google will sit in the same space. And I remember managers saying, nah, that'll never happen. Right.
Hmm.
And it did. And it didn't wait till 2020 either. There were a lot of things that people sketched out that you think, that I look at them today and I say, wow, it still needs to happen and I can't wait, but I can see it getting there. Right. So really thinking about what would all these trends coming together, what would they enable us if we really stepped outside the box? And these are methodologies we use, right? So when I work with companies today, and I work a lot with the startup market in Israel, or with multinationals coming into Israel looking at startups, um, you see a lot of these HR techs, ed techs, right? A lot of these technologies that corporations can't handle because they have a lot of systems, and it's you can't just try everything that's out there. But
Hmm.
probably should be looking at. They're very interesting thoughts about what learning means, right? Even what prerequisite skills and capabilities and experience means. How do you define relevant experience? How do you define a role and who you think would fit that role, right? We're used to thinking about job titles and resumes, but there are people there with relevant experience. It was just called something else, and they're shifting their abilities and their skills to, they could be doing a different twist on what you're looking for, and that could be the right thing for you. So I think the skills that we used and the methodologies we used back then, they actually started me on my blog, right? So my blog, really what it does is it curates content. So it takes future big trends and things that are out there. Even attending CES in January, and you look at this and you say, okay, wow, this is kind of run this into the future. What would work look like when you have VR and AR, right? How could we come together and collaborate without needing to be in the same space, maybe not even in the same time, maybe not speaking the same language? What would happen to work then?
Interesting. That's a fascinating point. And I think I remember that I was at a conference last month and addressing a panel, and basically there was a conversation. Someone asked me about, hey, how do you see the future? Like what how can you understand the future? And I told them that, okay, this time it's sort of different because over last 30-40 years technology is playing incremental role in defining what business and how to do business, and in that journey we are dependent more and more on technology. And now in nowadays technology itself is going through its own disruptions, right? So whether you call AI, whether you call battery technologies, whether you call like cloud and storage and on-prem security, everything is going through disruption. That means the entire business that's dependent on this technology, it's going through its own disruption, right? And that means that even the business models are getting redefined of what would it means to be a healthy business. Like, is it capital, like what does really capitalism mean nowadays? Like, it's not it now, it is a human element in that as well.
Yes,
Now
yes,
if you are running an organization as an HR leader, to decipher your sort of your company outlook into this new reality, like what would you, how do you console them, how do you, what would be your message to other HR leaders in companies with a very legacy business model? And I think it was funny, like I was talking to Tim from Tim O'Reilly, and from O'Reilly Media, and then when we were talking about how there are like two standards going on in the market nowadays. So if you say company like Intel or GE or IBM, if they miss out on their target, they will be hammered for missing out their targets. But if you say Netflix or Amazon, no one cares if they make money or not. Like they have a price, very high price earning ratio. It just goes bizarre. Like how do you console a legacy enterprise, that how difficult is the transformation, the HR transformation into this new reality of organization or of existence?
Probably $1 million question, probably more, right? And if there were an easy answer, then it wouldn't be one. Um, it depends on the situation, but I think the main elements aren't that there's a simple answer, but that you cannot ignore the organization or the human resource aspects of this transformation, which I think
Mm,
is what many companies are missing, right?
mm,
So let me give you an example from the training world, right? So we we used to think about training in terms of ROI, right? Are we going to
mm,
conduct the suite of training, or are we going to, offer it? In fact, about a decade ago, many companies cut down on spending in the training space because the ROI was not apparent, and we spent many years trying to figure out how do you measure training ROI. So if you look at this new world where the value of your human capital is actually reducing really fast because
mm,
each one of us came in, with a basic skill set, whatever profession we learned, um, and a lot of that knowledge is becoming irrelevant at an increasing speed. And so we need to stay relevant. We need to stay relevant as individuals. We need to stay relevant as professions. We need to stay relevant as teams. Training is not a highly recognized function, right? So you don't get recognition for attending a class. In fact, you just need to make up the time to do your work. And
mm,
so suddenly, training is about reskilling and upskilling. So at best to stay relevant, and probably more likely a company looking at its strategic path going forward will probably discover that a large proportion of their talent is going to become obsolete within the next decade for sure, maybe even 5 years. And then you say, okay, the old system was let's fire them and hire new people. That
mm,
doesn't work anymore. The
mm,
numbers are too big, you can't fire, and there's no people out there to hire, right? And so you need to start looking at your human capital and saying, okay, I can't afford to have that value deteriorate. I need to make sure people stay, and frankly, stay relevant isn't enough. I need to make sure that they, first of all, unlearn and let go of whatever's
mm,
not interesting anymore. That so that they need to know what that is. I need to tell them they're in jobs that are probably going to be obsolete or change very significantly in the next 5 to 10 years, and I need to show them the path to staying relevant and then upskilling and reskilling themselves, which again goes back to you can't manage this. You need to tell people what the options are, show them how to make sure, where to learn, and then let them take ownership of doing that, understanding that if they're not ready, they will lose their job. But they need to know, and we don't tell people these days. So we don't tell people the implication of this strategy is that these jobs and these businesses will
mm,
disappear. The implication of this strategy is we need a lot of people in this space. Here's how to learn, maybe even take a budget. So we saw Amazon announced recently, right, that they're allowing training and retraining. And frankly, they said, we realize that we'll probably miss about 30%. So people will be training for things we end up not needing, and they'll leave. And that's okay because we kept them in the system. And I think they're also counting on more companies doing the same. And so there will be others that will come in that, got trained by other companies. AT&T's been doing it for a number of years now, which is a really interesting experiment on a very large scale. So I think that's one of the examples of where companies are starting to understand that what we did doesn't work, and we need to start thinking different.
interesting. I think that's an excellent point. And another perspective, another point I want your perspective on is, so when we talk to many of the HR leaders who are in a legacy, so-called legacy business template, and when you talk to them about the employee and employer relationship and all that fun stuff, and I think recently I was talking to someone, and the conversation went in a very interesting way. So they suggested that, Vishal, there's a increase agility around using our data in HR, but HR has always been about people, and people are not really easily quantifiable. Like there's a lot of so the qualitative information about an employee, our inability to justify the quality of their work, push us to use their quantifiable traits of that worker, how much time they're spending, and that is pushing a lot of data driven technologies which are very premature and which are actually pushing towards quantifiable outcomes, and not a qualifiable outcomes. That is messing up a lot of HR, employer relationship. Like our understanding, we are pushing employees in a very quantified way, that you are just number in many ways, and not able to empower them so their quality of work would improve. And you have come from the world where the HR evolved. The HR evolved from that HR that I can go and talk to, versus now a form that I have to fill, and then someone in this green earth would come and say, okay, I want to talk to you about your problem now. So what's your perspective? What's your take on this sort of that understanding that there's an incremental need to use data, and that could be pushing HR in a different direction than where it should have been.
Yeah, first of all, I think you're touching on a really important point, right? So, um, if you think about the person, the working person, the way we think of data starts with the way we think of a resume, right? So it's where you went to school, what you learned, and what jobs you held, and what positions you held, and then within the company, you might have a little bit more information on, again, positions and job titles and some level of hierarchy that you can be associated with. Um, that is no longer the true story of a
Hmm.
professional person. LinkedIn is no longer who you are. It doesn't show the potential, the skills you've accumulated, the experience you've had, the places that didn't fall, no longer fall neatly under positions and job titles, right? And
Hmm.
so the 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 risk of talking about HR using data these days is that we try to control that uncomfortable feeling of needing to allow people to form in networks and get to the jobs and separate maybe between hierarchies and of management and work. So we don't like that. So we say, okay, we'll make that happen, but we'll manage it from the top. And so, tell us more about yourself. That might work if you run a big project and everybody updates some database on something, but it then 5 minutes later it's no longer accurate. And so I think one thing we'll see probably evolving in the next few years is a new way to portray, probably even externally, right? I mean, I think LinkedIn will evolve, and it might not be LinkedIn, but the idea of LinkedIn, right? Where we will need to see a different way of a person showing who they are professionally. That could be, baskets of experience and connections and networks and types of work. And then we would need to find different ways of finding each other coming together for work. And we will figure this out. And I'm pretty sure the more work gets digitized, and in some worlds it already is digitized, right? You have the ability to create the systems that will pick up on what your real experience is. But in other areas, it's more tricky, right? It's more difficult. So soft skills. So you don't
Hmm.
want people to just say, I'm great, I can do all this stuff. You want proof. You want to show, and that's why we ask for hard data. But the problem is hard data no longer portrays who we are. So I don't think in the next few years it's about using data, because I don't think we have the
Hmm.
data we need. I think in the next few years it's about understanding what's important, and then how do we shift our processes and systems to account for what's important. So if you want a team of people to come together to do a certain job, and all you do is you say, this is prerequisite experience or job titles or something like that, that's what you'll get. But if you describe what you're trying to make to accomplish, open it wide enough that somebody maybe in a completely different space can come back and tell you, you know what, I really have the relevant experience. Let me show you. One wonderful example, by the way, I look at the new industries. So look at technologies for autonomous vehicles, right?
Mm.
Nobody has graduated yet from a university with a title of engineer of autonomous vehicles, and yet there are a lot of people working in this field, and they come from a lot of different fields, right? What they did was they ported their experience and their relevant skills and their potential, and they showed how it will become relevant within this new field. And now we hired them, and suddenly they have a job title that they couldn't technically, you couldn't publish and say, I'm looking for this job title, right? Because they didn't exist in the market. We should be probably looking more at people. What is it that we can learn about what they can be doing versus the standard data we collect until we figure it out. I'm sure we will figure it out.
Mm.
How do you know more about who you really are, what you can, what your skills and capabilities are? But until we do, we actually need to figure out different ways to bring the right kind of experience and people together without getting hung up on the kinds of data we used to use that are no longer telling the real story.
Interesting. That's an extremely valid point. So now, when you interact with, and you are pretty active in Israel ecosystem, helping the tech sector there and helping the HR tech sector there. So when you see these startups emerging, like what are some of the things that you see the main focus when we say future of work? What exactly is future of work? Like, where do you see major focus and investment and intellectual investment happening? Like, what are some of the broad containers where you are seeing that there's a lot of activity in future of work, and where do you see on the other side less activity where you wanted to see more active, or you would like to see more activity? If you can walk us through.
I think we clearly see a lot of activity in the hiring space. So trying to figure out, and we see a lot of startups trying to figure out how to get that match, right? The right people to the right place at the right time in all sorts of ways, whether it's sharing between people, whether it's, different types of skill sets, whether it's just different ways to access talent, right? So we see a lot of startups in that space. We also see, I think we see a lot of startups in the learning space, starting with ed tech, but also into learning and corporate learning. And by the way, learning is greatly redefined, right? It's no longer a
Mm.
class with an instructor and some food on a table. It could be content that includes mentoring and micro mentoring and ability to access content that you need at the right time or access someone who knows, right? Which is, by the way, another class. I think we're seeing another class of startups in the space of the networking. So the understanding, and there are lots of studies today that shows that it's not so much what you know but who you know that knows, right? So
Mm.
how do you manage to get to the right people when you need them, whether it's because you have a question, you need mentoring, or you need information, or you're trying to bring them together to do work with you. So, kind of, these are some big buckets. It's interesting, and I think the place where there's work, probably not enough work, is really how to redefine who a professional profile is and what it looks like and how does it come together. So it's that replacing CV or resume, right? It's thinking about that. Like I said, it's very hard. We use resumes to quickly filter hard data. You touched on that point. It's very accurately. It's the hard data is shifting, and I don't think we have a grasp on how do you really filter and match these days. Um, I think these are the large buckets. Compensation and benefits. Um, I don't know if that gets a lot of attention. One
Mm.
of the interesting things that need to happen, I think, here isn't so much in the HR tech. I think it's more in the policy space, right? We
Mm.
have created over the last decades, maybe in 200 years or so, we've created systems to protect salaried employees. And there's a there's a big difference if you shift from being a salaried employee to being a freelancer or other forms of employment. And as you move forward and you look at this flexible market, you really should be protecting the worker for working as opposed to an employee for being one. So it needs to be um, same how you work. So
Mm.
if I want to contract with you, it doesn't matter if in what form, and that's something that the bigger systems haven't figured out yet. And we're seeing some work in the space because it's becoming a problem, because labor laws are hindering some of the
Mm.
flexibility, and we're also seeing the other side of it, which is employees suffering from that over flexibility. So some of that needs to happen, but that's at the bigger policy
Interesting. I
level.
think I'm glad you are picking up the point on labor laws. I'll get to the government part as well. But I think one thing I want your perspective on. You assist a lot of large enterprises as well in their HR conversations. So when you talk about HR putting off fires, internal fires, versus HR focusing on future of work, like how much are you seeing, what percentage of HR is now actually focusing on the future, or basically active rather than reactive? Like how much HR are you seeing where businesses are actually proactively talking about future of work, vis-a-vis of, hey, it's just a five folks on the corner talking about future of work, well, 5,000 of them putting off fires. Like, what are you seeing, at least from the large enterprise perspective, that how is the market shifting, or what's your take on that?
So it might be a surprising answer. I don't think companies should be talking about the future of work. I
Mm.
think what they should be talking about is how the strategies that are evolving, they're the standard things they do in terms of the markets that are changing, the customers, the expectations, where all that meets everything that HR is about, right? Where it meets the
Mm.
organization, where it meets the talent, where it meets compensation, where it meets flexibility, where it meets structures and decision making processes and
Mm.
motivational aspects. So the future of work is about opening up, or well, frankly, it's no longer the future, but what we're seeing, right, is more granularity in terms of what is possible. So
Mm.
if it was, there were less options in terms of you could hire, or you could, bring in consultants, or temporary workers with some limitations. Now you can have a lot of different types, even crowdsource, some of your problems. If we used to work in structures, so my manager um, was also the manager of my work. That's no longer true. Most of us work in
Mm.
teams where we have multiple kinds of teams, and probably none of them are managed by our manager, or at least most of them aren't, right? And so the changing nature of work is about the breaking of the systems that used to be the norm, right? So I think the HR role in this period is to understand that the tool set that a management has to drive strategy, the real operational work strategy, is bigger than just, okay, well, we'll reorg and we'll, create some bonus plan. So if you think, and this frankly isn't that new, right? You think of Ford, right? When Ford wanted to create a car for everyone, created the assembly line.
Mm.
So he realized he couldn't just do it by asking people to work quicker, right? So we kind of are doing that right now. We're taking people and we're asking them to take on more. Instead of asking, how do we dismantle some of this and say, okay, can we do this in a different way? How can we use different systems, different processes, different people, different, almost everything can be different. You just need to test it. Now, big corporations can't test it by going live with something. It's too risky, right? But you could always test it in small places. So this very delicate balance, right, between what you need to deliver to the markets. There's always those other things on the side that are not in the core, or that are starting to look like they're going to be different. Think of banks going digital, right, or
Mm.
credit cards going, a- away, or disappearing, for other methods of payment. there are people whose job was all about the banking system the way it
Hmm.
was. So what are you going to do about, the processes and the way things are in the branches and even the space, right? When you're going digital, how do you think differently about that? HR, a good HR team needs to get ahead of this. They need to be asking the questions even before management gets around to it. Because when management works strategy, HR should be saying, okay, this strategy is going to hit the ground. What does it do to people, to management, to organizations, to decision making, to processes, to my hirings? You need to start thinking about these things and creating a much broader range of possibilities and tools that are than what we're used to be working with.
Interesting. Interesting. And if an HR leader from a small company is watching this conversation, like what would you suggest to those leaders? Like how would they create a company that's is future compliant, that's progressive in nature, and basically it gels into this new norms of work, because I'm hoping that eventually, as we are settling into this new and lot of interesting ideas of creating corporations, we might see a lot more innovative solutions coming on the road as well. So the companies would stay agile in adopting to this new template. Like what would you suggest to these who are building their startup from ground up? What are some of the best practices that you could share with those folks?
So there's a really big difference between startups and then when you actually become like a small medium sized company. Um, Startups are an interesting world to learn from because by definition there's no structure. Even job titles are kind of fluid and people just gravitate towards what's the right thing to do. They're also interesting to watch in terms of hiring because when you want to
Mm,
bring talent in, you don't sit there and define, to the nth degree the role and the position and the prerequisites. You kind of say, this is what I'm thinking about. Who do you know that fits this bill? It gets tricky once you grow and you can't manage this on a scale larger than 50 or 60 people. You just need to
mm,
start bringing in processes. Suddenly you don't know everyone. Suddenly not everybody knows you. You don't hear everything. And I always tell middle management, the higher up you go, the more quiet it gets, the more people reviewed the PowerPoint before you saw it, and there's a lot of stuff that you should know about that never made it to the slides, right? so
mm,
so you need to start developing different ways of actually hitting the ground and listening to what's going on. There are very cool crowdsourcing conversation tools these days, right? So instead of a survey that comes out once a year, and think about how the world is, people will say everywhere what they think. Then they
mm,
come into the organization and nobody asks them. But
mm,
if you only talk or ask, they'll tell you. So something about how we listen, the waterfall of communication is no longer a waterfall. In fact, you should probably turn it upside down. It
mm,
proportionally should be listening more than talking. The higher up you are. Um, so I think it's something about making space for these things because these things don't happen. When we get up, we have a calendar full of meetings. We spend our day in conference rooms, closed doors. You go back home, start another day. Um, Building those into your system, right? Building it so that you have these conversations, and there are ways to create those at a mass scale if you need. There are tools out there today that allow you to do that. And then of course there's the culture, right? Everything we say and do speaks, and then everything we don't say and don't do also speaks. And so, are you creating a culture where people are not just allowed to fail, they're applauded for shutting something down or having tried? Or are you creating a culture where you just deliver? And are you creating a culture where learning and growth are important? Or are you creating a culture where it's a waste of time? There,
mm,
it's a lot of little things like that. And it's part of it's interesting because we started our career or at least I did, in a world where that was simpler, right? You studied a body of knowledge, you have a body of knowledge that defines who you are professionally, and you have like 80% of the answers, right? So we're used
Hmm.
to asking for the answers. So we were taught the answers and then tested on the answers, right? So we're looking for the answers. There are no simple answers. And we need to start getting really good at exploring different options, understanding very quickly which ones are not working, and allowing to, build as we go some of those that seem to be.
Interesting. And let's spend a few minutes on the government policy and policy designing stuff. So I was talking to one of the government official for one of the recently large country, and he brought up a very interesting point that I, as a data scientist, never thought about. So he said, Vishal, you know what? Government runs on tax dollars, right? You pay by taxes and government run, and people pay taxes. And because of our focus on automation, not many people are paying taxes, right? It's because AI doesn't pay tax, people do. And if AI disrupt work, then government will also lose money on technologies, right? So their perspective was it's in government's interest. Now they are realizing, at least few of them that even we are chatting with, that government has a role to play when it comes to keeping their citizens gainfully employed, to the point where they fund the government and government run, and it just goes back and forth. And then you also talked about sort of interesting dynamics of work and work ethic, and part time versus full time versus labor laws and all that fun stuff. So from your perspective, how is the role, like, what would you want government to do? Like, how do you want governments to engage and help with this new reality?
So, first of all, it's not enough to keep people employed, because we could be
Hmm.
going about that in a very wrong way, like, you know, keeping people in jobs that they're no longer needed in, and creating, causing companies to fail because they're carrying
Hmm.
overhead. We need to
Hmm.
keep people employed and productive. In fact, we
Hmm.
need to be more productive. So technology should be making us more productive,
Hmm.
but it should be making everyone more productive. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of conversation on this, and the one side of this argument says, technology will come in. It's always come in. It's killed some jobs, created new jobs. It'd be okay. And then the other side of this conversation says this is different, right? Technology is coming in, it's killing more jobs than we can seem to be creating, and
Hmm.
we will end up unemployed, and that's a big problem. So I don't, I don't know where we will land, but one thing's for sure: we're creating, or technology is cutting certain skill sets, making them obsolete, making
Hmm.
certain tasks obsolete, making certain professions obsolete, and it's adding others at the top. And frankly, it probably always did. I mean, if you think,
Hmm.
many years ago, only mathematicians knew algebra. Today, we teach it in elementary schools, right? So skills flow down and become more common. Is something we've always done. So today, coding and data scientists is maybe high end, and we used to not be able to read and write, right? Only certain people did. Now everyone does. And so maybe in a few years, everyone needs to know coding and need to be able to deal with data. So one thing that we will need to figure out the next few years, from kind of broader society and government functions, is uh, is education and lifelong learning. So we can't teach people answers and test them on answers and then expect them to come into the workplace where they're waiting for somebody to tell them what to do. That no longer works. So we need to figure out the right skill sets, and then help people learn to learn. And then we can no longer package these degrees in 3 to 4 year segments, that now you're kind of 10 years in and you need to update your skills. What do you need to do? Go back to school and study another 4 year degree? That doesn't work. So we need to
Hmm.
create different systems that allow people to upskill themselves, which means that they might need to, for some periods of time, maybe cut back on some work hours, and they need to free uh, pay, or savings, or some other system, so that they can afford to go study and better themselves. So we need to be able to keep doing that for more years. And then our social systems, right? I mean, pension, if you live in countries where pension was there, is we can't create pension plans where people retire at 60 something. This is not possible. You can't save 30 years and fund 30 years of non-work, right? So
Hmm.
you need to think about longer years. And if you think about longer years, people when they're 60, they don't want to work like they worked when they were
Hmm.
20, right? So you need to think about other ways to allow people to be productive and then earn an income that isn't necessarily your standard full-time employment. And so there's a lot of work in this space. It needs to look at how all this redefines the implications on what a person needs to do throughout their career in terms of training, in terms of degrees of employment, in terms of types of employment, and and then allow the systems to build around that so that we can do all that. Right now, we're kind of on our own, because no one's creating the systems to do that. And
Interesting.
so we see people abusing them, which is a problem.
Yeah, I think valid point, and thank you for sharing your perspective on that. So we almost on the tail end of the conversation. So work futures, right? So your independent practice. So where do you spend your most of the time? Like what in this work future concept? Where are you spending most of your time? Like where do you see there's a lot of demand on you're seeing a lot of opportunities?
So I think what's I spend most of my time with companies and policymakers. And the interesting story is I've spent many years studying the way that career paths are changing. But the interesting piece is it's not just relevant for the person, right? So, for
Mm,
example, if our career path was fairly standard, once we got a profession, you went to work for some employer in an industry, and you looked up and you saw your manager and their boss, and that was kind of your career path.
mm,
And yes, we adapted, but it was kind of a ladder, if you will. Um, and so our systems in the organization met that ladder. So we defined climbing the ladder. We defined
mm,
development with respect to that. We also defined what growth meant, and we defined retention as metrics, right? And we also had a lot of time to spend training people and growing them, and then many years where they could give back. That's changing. And so when people started understanding that their work stability was no longer dependent on a company, that it was dependent on their own ability to stay
mm,
relevant in their career market, they started asking for things like develop me. Show me that this by the end of this year, I'm going to have more skills and more relevant experience than I did walking into this year. And so they started looking for managers who didn't just tell them what to do, but also coached and mentored them. And they started wanting to move quicker and gain more experience and make some moves that we looked at that and we said, that's odd. Why would you want to do that? Well, because it's no longer a ladder. They're climbing different paths, and they're forming the way as they go. And so
mm,
most of my time is spent working with managers and organizations, and then as well as policymakers, to understand the implications of this change to how we manage, to the systems we create, to how to motivate and engage people, and then also to what else do we need to build around them so that everyone's success. Frankly, what you want is to kind of have all the ships go up as the water level rises, as opposed to some of them sink.
interesting, interesting. So now let's spend few minutes on your journey. Let's spend few minutes on. So we ask all of our guests to share uh, maybe three things that has real or three qualities that has really helped them be what they like, that has helped them become what they have become. Like what are those three qualities? What are those three qualities you attribute your success to?
It's interesting because the first one probably is not going to be a quality, but I had fabulous managers. I was very fortunate to have managers who were really um, they really saw me for better and worse, right? So they helped me shape. They pushed me out of my comfort zone. They put a mirror up to my face when I needed it. They pushed me when I needed it, and they hugged me when I needed that, right? So they basically um, allowed me to travel and make career moves that were not standard and try out things that were not considered the normal path. And so I think where I ended up was having a very varied career journey that allows me to look at, for example, an organization today from all those different, perspectives. So I can speak as an employee and as a senior manager, but I could also speak as finance, as HR.
Mm,
M&A is a wonderful venture into what disruption looks like, right? Because acquired
mm,
companies go through very big disruption, and I managed multiple of these acquisitions at very large scales. I also was very fortunate to um, trot the globe. So
mm,
I've worked in every single region in the world. I've lived in most of them, and I speak multiple languages. And so um, I've learned, and I learned some of those the really hard way, right? So you kind of learn to translate, and also when you're unable to translate, right? Whether it's
mm.
corporate culture or language or country culture, right? So it's given me a very broad perspective on how to read between the lines and how to create a picture with a lot of missing pieces in there, which I think is helping me today.
Interesting, interesting, and thank you for sharing that to our listeners and viewers. So, we ask all of our guests to share some of their favorite reads, some of the books that they really appreciate, and they can. Um, that's what would your list be like? What would your some of one or two or three favorite books that you could share with our listeners and viewers?
So I read a lot, but before I give you a little bit of the reads, here's what I do, because sometimes I write in my blog and I write about a lot of books, and people ask me, so how do you read so much? So there's a little secret there. So today every book that comes out starts with speaking engagements, right?
Mm,
So as I'm on the cross trainer or the treadmill in the gym, I watch a lot of TED talks and talks, right, by people who publish books and then others. And so
mm,
I when I find myself wanting to highlight as they're speaking, right, then I go ahead and I buy the book. So I do a lot of my reading through figuring out what I want to read by listening to these different ideas as they
interesting.
emerge. Um, One of my favorite ones in the last I think few months, it's a bit late because it's not that new, but was Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman, right? Because I think
Mm,
um, one of the examples, one of the issues I see is a lot of people are trying to slow down what's happening, right? They're trying to fight against it. Just like, we really
mm,
loved it the way it was. Here's everything everybody else should be doing so that it doesn't change. Um, and I think when you read that book, you really start to understand everything that's happening, and it's a good mirror up in your face to say, okay, this isn't going away, and it's not going anywhere. So that was another one that was very good. I I follow conscious capitalism closely,
mm.
which is also
Great.
generated a lot of good reads in terms of servant leadership and um,
Awesome, awesome. So, last but not the least, so if you want something for our listeners and viewers to take away from this conversation, like what would that be? What would be your closing remark for our listeners and viewers?
you can't ignore what's going on. You know
Mm,
it, and I think what I try to do is take what makes me uncomfortable and then actually dive head in, right? So instead of lean back and think about, I really don't want to be doing this, you say no, you actually lean into this and get through the uncomfortable. When you come out on the other side, you're able to help everyone that's still um, getting their feet wet. So I think it's really realizing that you cannot ignore this. It will not go
mm,
away. And someone out there is doing something that will hit whatever you are doing, whether it's your business or your job. someone out there is creating something that will change that and just completely topple it on its head. And so the question is, are you going to actively be out there looking for that and then riding that wave, or are you going to be, kicking and screaming and tagging along? So um, that would be, if there's one thing you remember, is actually lean into the disruption. It's the only way out.
I think that's fabulous thought, and thank you so much, Nirit, for it's. I think it's. I've told you like number of times. Talking to you is always like a therapy. It's very getting to see what's going on, and thank you so much for being candid with your time. So being very generous with your time, helping us understand what's going on in the future of workspace. You're always welcome back on the podcast, and wish you success for your book. And I hope to see you back to discuss your book and basically uh, discuss, share with our community what is all about, so they can go and grab their hands on the book. And thank you again, and wish you nothing but success. Needless to say, if you're in Boston, you have a home, so let me know and we should catch up.
Thank you, Michelle. It's always a pleasure talking to you. It's we've had a fabulous virtual journey together. So yeah, I'll definitely be back. Thank you for
Awesome.
having me again.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a